The land stretched wide and quiet under a pale southern sky, a vast expanse of dry grasslands and scattered hills, where the wind moved slowly through the veldt as if it had all the time in the world. Long before the first shots of the Boer War were fired, this land had already shaped the people who lived upon it. The story of the war did not begin with soldiers or battles, but with distance, isolation, and a deep, growing tension between two very different ways of life. In the southern tip of Africa, the British Empire had slowly extended its reach over the 19th century, establishing control over the Cape Colony, a place of trade, ships, and global importance. The British brought with them their systems, their laws, and their ambitions, tying the region into the vast network of empire that stretched across continents. But beyond the coastal cities, far into the interior, lived the Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers who had moved inland over generations, seeking independence, land, and a life away from imperial control. These Boer communities were not large cities or structured colonies. They were scattered farms, wide apart from one another, connected by dirt tracks and shared traditions. Life here was slow and difficult, shaped by the land itself. Families relied on cattle, on crops, and on their ability to endure long stretches of isolation. Over time, they developed a strong sense of identity, rooted in independence, faith, and a quiet resistance to outside authority. The tension between the British and the Boers had been building for decades, long before the war itself began. In the early 19th century, British rule at the Cape introduced new laws, including the abolition of slavery, which disrupted the Boer way of life. Many Boers, unwilling to live under British governance, packed their belongings and began what became known as the Great Trek, a long migration into the interior of southern Africa. They moved with ox-drawn wagons across harsh terrain, facing not only the challenges of the land, but also conflicts with indigenous African kingdoms already established there. From this migration, two Boer republics eventually emerged: the South African Republic, often called the Transvaal, and the Orange Free State. These were not powerful nations in the traditional sense, but they were fiercely independent, governed by their own people, and deeply protective of their autonomy. For a time, there was an uneasy balance between these republics and the expanding British presence. But the balance did not last. In the late 19th century, something changed that would alter the fate of the region forever. Beneath the soil of the Transvaal, vast deposits of gold were discovered. It was one of the richest gold finds in the world, and it transformed the quiet, rural republic into a place of sudden global importance. Almost overnight, prospectors, businessmen, and fortune seekers arrived from across the world, many of them British. They came in waves, drawn by the promise of wealth, and they settled in growing towns around the mines. For the Boer government, this influx created a new and dangerous problem. These newcomers, known as Uitlanders, quickly outnumbered the original Boer population in some areas. They brought with them not only economic power, but also demands for political rights. They wanted representation, influence, and a say in how the republic was governed. The Boers, however, saw this as a direct threat to their independence. Granting full rights to the Uitlanders could eventually hand control of their republic to outsiders. Tension grew slowly, then steadily. The British government, watching from afar, saw both opportunity and obligation. On one hand, there was the immense wealth of the gold fields, something no empire could ignore. On the other, there were British citizens living under a government that denied them political rights. These issues became intertwined, turning local disputes into matters of imperial concern. Diplomacy attempted to ease the situation, but it moved slowly, weighed down by mistrust on both sides. Meetings were held, proposals discussed, and promises made, but beneath it all, neither side was willing to fully yield. The Boers feared losing their independence. The British feared losing influence over a region that was becoming increasingly important. Then came the Jameson Raid in 1895, a turning point that deepened the divide. A group of armed men, led by Dr. Leander Jameson and backed by certain British interests, launched a failed invasion into the Transvaal, hoping to spark an uprising among the Uitlanders. The plan collapsed quickly. The raid failed, and its leaders were captured. But the damage was already done. Trust, which had been fragile to begin with, was shattered. For the Boers, the raid confirmed their worst fears, that the British were willing to use force to take control. For the British government, it was an embarrassment, but it also revealed how unstable the situation had become. After the raid, both sides began to prepare, quietly at first, then more openly. Weapons were gathered, defenses were strengthened, alliances were considered. The land itself seemed unchanged during this time. The veldt remained vast and open, the sky wide and indifferent. Farms continued their routines. Mines dug deeper into the earth. But beneath this calm surface, the tension was tightening like a rope being slowly pulled from both ends. By the late 1890s, negotiations had reached their limits. The Boer republics, especially the Transvaal under President Paul Kruger, demanded guarantees of independence and control over their internal affairs. The British, under leaders like Alfred Milner, pushed for reforms that would increase British influence and grant rights to the Uitlanders. Neither side stepped back. In October 1899, the tension finally broke. The Boer republics issued an ultimatum to the British, demanding the withdrawal of troops from their borders. It was a bold move, driven by the belief that war was now unavoidable. When the ultimatum expired without acceptance, the Boers acted first. War had begun. At first, it did not look like the kind of war the British Empire was used to fighting. The Boers were not a traditional army in uniform ranks. They were farmers, hunters, and riders, skilled with rifles and deeply familiar with the land. They moved quickly, using the terrain to their advantage, striking where least expected, then disappearing again into the vastness of the veldt. In the opening months, Boer forces advanced into British territories, laying siege to key towns such as Ladysmith, Kimberley, and Mafeking. These sieges became some of the defining early moments of the war. Inside the towns, British soldiers and civilians endured long periods of isolation, with limited supplies and constant threat from surrounding forces. Outside, the Boers waited patiently, using their mobility and knowledge of the land to maintain pressure without rushing into unnecessary losses. It was a different kind of warfare, slower, more deliberate, shaped by distance and endurance rather than rapid conquest. The British, surprised by the effectiveness of Boer tactics, suffered a series of early defeats. These setbacks shook confidence and forced a re-evaluation of strategy. Reinforcements were sent from across the empire, and plans were made for a larger, more coordinated effort to regain control. As the second day of war turned into weeks, and weeks into months, it became clear that this conflict would not be short. The vast land, the determined fighters, and the deep-rooted causes of the war ensured that it would stretch far beyond initial expectations. And so, under the wide African sky, the Boer War moved into its next phase, carrying with it not just armies and weapons, but the weight of history, identity, and the struggle between empire and independence. The war did not rush forward. It unfolded slowly across the wide, open land, where distance itself became part of the struggle. After the first strikes and early Boer successes, a quiet realization settled over both sides that this conflict would not be decided quickly. The vastness of southern Africa, with its rolling veldt, scattered hills, and long, empty stretches between towns, shaped every movement, every decision, and every moment of waiting. In the besieged towns of Ladysmith, Kimberley, and Mafeking, time began to stretch in a different way. Days were marked not by progress, but by endurance. Inside Ladysmith, British soldiers and civilians lived under constant pressure, surrounded by Boer forces who had taken positions on the high ground. Artillery fire would come and go, sometimes distant, sometimes close enough to shake the earth beneath their feet. Between these moments, there was a strange stillness where people waited, rationed food, and tried to maintain a sense of normal life in a place that was no longer safe. Kimberley, with its diamond mines, carried a different kind of tension. It was a place of wealth, industry, and importance, now cut off from the outside world. Supplies grew limited, and the people inside had to adapt, finding ways to stretch what little they had. The mines themselves, once symbols of opportunity, became part of the defense, their tunnels and resources repurposed in quiet, determined efforts to hold out until help arrived. Far to the north, Mafeking became a symbol of resistance. The siege there lasted longer than many expected, and its defense was marked by careful planning and steady resolve. The town's defenders, under the leadership of Robert Baden-Powell, used creativity as much as strength, constructing defenses, managing limited resources, and maintaining morale in the face of isolation. The siege turned into a test not just of military ability, but of patience and endurance, stretching on as the outside world watched closely. Beyond the towns, the war moved across the land in scattered, shifting patterns. The Boers, mounted and highly mobile, continued to use their deep knowledge of the terrain. They did not fight in rigid lines or large formations. Instead, they spread out, taking positions behind rocks, ridges, and natural cover. From there, they fired with precision, then moved again, always avoiding unnecessary exposure. Their rifles, accurate over long distances, gave them an advantage in the open veldt, where traditional formations could become vulnerable. For the British forces, this style of fighting required adjustment. Many soldiers had been trained for different kinds of warfare, where clear lines, direct engagements, and visible fronts defined a battlefield. Here, the enemy was often unseen, hidden in the landscape itself. A hill that appeared empty could suddenly reveal rifle fire. A quiet stretch of land could turn into a zone of danger without warning. The early months of the war brought a series of difficult moments for the British. Battles such as those fought in December 1899, a period that would later be remembered as Black Week, showed how challenging the conflict had become. In a series of engagements, British forces attempted to push back Boer positions, but faced strong resistance and unexpected setbacks. Losses were significant, and the confidence that had once accompanied the Empire's military strength was shaken. These defeats did not end the war, but they changed its tone. Reinforcements were called from across the Empire. Soldiers from Britain, from India, from Australia, from Canada, and other parts of the imperial world began to arrive. The scale of the conflict grew larger, the movement of troops more organized, and the determination to regain control more focused. As more British forces gathered, the strategy began to shift. Instead of smaller, uncertain advances, larger and more coordinated operations were planned. Railways became critical lines of movement, carrying soldiers, supplies, and equipment across long distances. Camps were established, and the presence of the British Army became more visible across the region. The land, however, did not change. The veldt remained wide and open, the distances long, the conditions demanding. Soldiers on both sides faced the same environment: the heat of the day, the cold of the night, the dust that settled on everything, and the constant need for water. These shared hardships created a strange balance, where the land itself stood as a quiet, unchanging force in the background of the war. By early 1900, the British began to push forward with greater strength. The sieges that had defined the early phase of the war started to break. Kimberley was relieved first, after a determined effort that forced Boer forces to withdraw. Not long after, Ladysmith was also freed, its long period of isolation finally coming to an end. Mafeking held out even longer, and when its siege was lifted, the news spread widely, becoming a moment of celebration far beyond the battlefield. These victories marked a turning point, but they did not end the war. Instead, they signaled the beginning of a new phase. The British, now reinforced and reorganized, moved deeper into the Boer republics, aiming to take control of key cities and administrative centers. The Boers, in response, began to adapt once again, preparing for a different kind of struggle. The conflict was shifting from set-piece battles and sieges into something less defined, more drawn out, and more difficult to control. The open engagements of the early war were giving way to a slower, more scattered form of resistance, one that would test endurance even further. And so, as the second phase of the Boer War began to take shape, the land remained the same: vast, quiet, and watchful, while the nature of the conflict changed within it, moving toward a long and uncertain path that neither side could fully predict. As the war moved beyond the early sieges and into a new phase, the rhythm of the conflict changed in a quiet but decisive way. The British advance, now stronger and more organized, began to press deeper into the Boer republics. Large columns of soldiers moved steadily across the land, supported by railways that carried supplies and reinforcements over long distances. Towns that had once stood as symbols of Boer independence slowly came under British control, one after another, not always through dramatic battles, but through a gradual and persistent push forward. Bloemfontein, the capital of the Orange Free State, fell into British hands in early 1900. It was not just a military victory, but a symbolic moment. The town, once a center of Boer governance, now stood quiet under new control. Yet even as the British raised their presence there, the wider land beyond remained uncertain. Control of a town did not mean control of the vast countryside that stretched endlessly in every direction. From Bloemfontein, the British continued northward, their movements deliberate and steady. The landscape changed subtly as they advanced, rolling plains giving way to more varied terrain, dotted with ridges and distant hills. The air carried the same dry stillness, the same quiet wind moving across the veldt. It was a land that revealed little, hiding its challenges in its openness. Soon, the focus turned toward Pretoria, the capital of the South African Republic, the Transvaal. Its capture would mark another turning point, a sign that the organized resistance of the Boer governments was weakening. British forces moved closer, step by step, securing lines of communication, repairing railways, and maintaining a steady supply of food, ammunition, and equipment. When Pretoria was finally occupied in June 1900, it seemed, for a moment, as though the war might be nearing its end. The capitals had fallen. The structures of Boer governance had been disrupted. From the perspective of a traditional war, these were decisive achievements. But the reality unfolding across the land told a different story. The Boer fighters did not disappear. Instead, they changed. Without the need to defend fixed capitals or large towns, Boer commandos became even more mobile. Small groups of fighters moved across the countryside, blending into the land they knew so well. They no longer sought large battles. Instead, they watched, waited, and struck when opportunity allowed. A railway line might be damaged in the night. A supply convoy might be ambushed on a quiet stretch of road. A small outpost might come under sudden attack, only for the attackers to vanish again before a response could be organized. This new phase of the war required patience above all else. For the British, holding territory became more complex than capturing it. Lines of communication had to be protected across vast distances. Railways, once symbols of control, became targets. Every mile of track required attention. Every movement carried risk. The land itself seemed to favor this kind of warfare. The wide veldt offered space to move, to disappear, to reappear somewhere unexpected. Hills and ridges provided cover. Farms, scattered and isolated, could offer shelter or supplies. The Boers, familiar with every detail of this environment, used it to their advantage, turning the openness of the land into a kind of quiet shield. For the soldiers on both sides, daily life settled into a slow and demanding routine. Marches stretched across long distances, often under the weight of heat during the day and cold during the night. Camps were set up and taken down repeatedly, each one temporary, each one part of a larger, ongoing movement. Dust clung to uniforms, to equipment, to the air itself, becoming a constant presence. Moments of action came suddenly, breaking the long stretches of waiting. A distant shot, a signal passed quietly, a shift in the atmosphere, and then movement. But just as quickly, the stillness would return, leaving behind only traces of what had happened. The British response to this new form of resistance began to evolve. Traditional approaches were no longer enough. New strategies were considered, aimed not only at engaging Boer fighters directly, but also at limiting their ability to move and operate freely. It was a slow process of adjustment, shaped by experience, by trial, and by the realities of the land. At the same time, the human cost of the war continued to grow. Farms were abandoned or damaged. Families were displaced. The quiet rural life that had once defined much of the region was disrupted, replaced by uncertainty and movement. The war was no longer confined to battlefields. It spread into the everyday lives of those who lived on the land. And yet, through all of this, the landscape remained unchanged in its presence. The sky stretched wide above, the wind moved across the grass, and the distant hills stood silent. It was as if the land observed everything without judgment, holding within it the slow passage of the war. As months passed, it became clear that this phase of the conflict would not be resolved quickly. The fall of capitals had not ended the war. It had transformed it into something more prolonged, more dispersed, and more difficult to define. Victory, once imagined as a single decisive moment, now seemed distant, shaped instead by endurance, adaptation, and time. The Boer War had entered a quieter, more complex stage, one where movement replaced confrontation, and patience became as important as strength. And under the endless sky of southern Africa, the story continued, unfolding slowly, one careful step at a time. As the war stretched further into time, it became quieter on the surface, yet deeper in its impact. The great movements of armies, the capturing of capitals, and the early dramatic sieges had given way to something slower, more persistent, and far more exhausting for everyone involved. The conflict had settled into the land itself, spreading across farms, railway lines, and distant outposts, where no single moment defined it, but where every day carried its weight. The Boer commandos continued their movement across the vast veldt, never staying in one place for long. They traveled lightly, often on horseback, carrying only what they needed. Their knowledge of the land allowed them to move along hidden paths, to find water where it was scarce, and to disappear into the distance before a larger force could reach them. They were no longer defending cities or borders. Instead, they were preserving resistance, keeping the war alive through motion and patience. For the British, the challenge became one of control rather than conquest. Holding the land required constant presence. Railways had to be guarded, supply lines maintained, and communication kept open across great distances. Small blockhouses, simple fortified structures, began to appear along railway lines and across key routes. Built from stone or corrugated iron, they stood at intervals across the landscape, each one housing a small group of soldiers. Connected by barbed wire, they formed a network, slowly tightening across the land, limiting the freedom of movement that the Boer fighters had once used so effectively. This system did not bring quick resolution. Instead, it changed the pace of the war once again. Movement became more difficult, more restricted. Each path was watched. Each crossing carried risk. The open veldt, once a space of freedom for the commandos, was gradually divided into controlled sections. It was a slow process, measured not in days, but in months. At the same time, a harsher reality began to unfold across the countryside. In an effort to weaken the Boer resistance, British forces adopted a policy that would have lasting consequences. Farms, which had long served as places of shelter and supply for the commandos, were destroyed. Crops were burned, livestock removed, and homes left empty. The intention was to remove support for the fighters, but the result was the displacement of families who had lived on the land for generations. Women and children, along with many black African laborers and families caught in the same circumstances, were moved into camps. These camps were not designed for comfort or long-term living. They were overcrowded with limited resources, and conditions were difficult. Disease spread easily, and a lack of proper food and sanitation led to suffering on a large scale. Life in these camps was marked by waiting for supplies, for news, for the war to end. The existence of these camps became one of the most somber aspects of the war. Far from the movement of commandos and the guarding of railways, they represented the human cost in its most direct form. Families who had once lived independently on the land now found themselves confined, their lives reshaped by a conflict they could not escape. Meanwhile, the commandos continued their resistance, though the pressure on them increased steadily. Supplies became harder to find. Movement grew more dangerous as the network of blockhouses expanded. Yet they persisted, carrying on through long rides across the veldt, through nights spent under open skies, through moments of action followed by long stretches of silence. For the soldiers on the British side, the war had also become a test of endurance. Guarding a blockhouse, patrolling a railway, or marching across open land required patience as much as strength. The days could be long and uneventful, the nights quiet but tense. The environment itself added to the challenge. The heat of the sun, the chill of the evening, the dust that settled over everything. Over time, the rhythm of the war became less about sudden events and more about steady persistence. As 1901 turned into 1902, the possibility of a clear and decisive victory seemed distant. Instead, there was a growing understanding that the war could only end through agreement. The cost, in time, in resources, and in human lives, had become too great to continue indefinitely. Negotiations began quietly, carried out between representatives of the British government and leaders of the remaining Boer forces. These discussions were not simple. They involved questions of independence, governance, and the future of the land itself. Each side carried its own concerns, its own hopes, and its own memories of what had been lost. Finally, in May 1902, the Treaty of Vereeniging was signed. The war came to an end not with a final battle, but with an agreement shaped by exhaustion and the need to move forward. The Boer republics accepted British sovereignty, becoming part of the British Empire, but with promises of eventual self-government. Reconstruction would begin, and efforts would be made to rebuild what had been damaged. When the fighting stopped, the land remained. The veldt stretched as it always had, quiet and wide beneath the open sky. The railways still ran across it. The farms, though many had been destroyed, would slowly return. The towns would rebuild. Life in time would find its way back into rhythm. The Boer War left behind more than changes in control or territory. It reshaped the region, influencing the path that would eventually lead to the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910. It also left lessons about the nature of modern warfare, about the limits of power, and about the cost carried by those far from the battlefield. And so, the story of the Boer War comes to rest not in a moment of triumph, but in a quiet ending. A long conflict spread across a vast land, resolved not by a single decisive act, but by the slow realization that it could not continue forever. Under the same wide sky, the land remained still, holding within it the memory of those years, of movement, of waiting, of struggle, and of the quiet return to peace that followed. In the months that followed the end of the war, the land did not change quickly. There was no sudden transformation, no immediate return to what had once been. Instead, everything moved slowly, as if the earth itself needed time to settle after years of strain. The fields that had been burned did not turn green overnight. The farms that had been abandoned stood quiet, their structures worn and empty, their fences broken, their paths overgrown with dust and silence. Families began to return, step by step, to places that no longer felt the same. Where homes had once stood full of life, there were now only fragments, charred wood, collapsed roofs, and the faint outlines of rooms that had held memories. The act of rebuilding was not only physical. It required patience, resilience, and a quiet acceptance that what had been lost could not fully be restored. Each repaired wall, each replanted field, was part of a slow effort to bring life back into a land that had been deeply unsettled. Across the countryside, the movement of people replaced the movement of armies. Wagons once used for migration or supply now carried families returning home, carrying tools, seeds, and what little remained of their possessions. The sounds of war, distant gunfire, marching boots, the rumble of artillery, faded, replaced by quieter rhythms. The creaking of wooden wheels, the soft calls of workers in the fields, the steady return of daily life. The camps, too, began to empty, though their memory did not fade so easily. Those who had lived within them carried the experience with them long after they left. The hardship, the waiting, the loss, these became part of the shared memory of the war, shaping how it would be remembered for generations. The camps were dismantled, their structures removed or left to decay, but the stories remained, carried quietly by those who had endured them. In the towns, change came in a different form. Administration shifted, new systems were put into place, and the presence of British authority became more structured and visible. Roads were repaired, railways restored, and communication lines re-established. There was an effort to bring order, to create stability, to rebuild not just what had been damaged, but what had been disrupted. Yet beneath these efforts, there remained a deeper layer of uncertainty. The war had not only altered the land, it had changed relationships between people. Trust had been strained, identities had hardened, and the memory of conflict lingered in quiet ways. Conversations were careful. Interactions carried a sense of distance. The process of reconciliation, like the rebuilding of farms, was slow and uncertain. Time, however, continued to move in its steady, unchanging way. Seasons passed over the land, just as they always had. Rains returned, softening the dry earth. Grass began to grow again across the veldt, covering the scars of trenches and tracks left behind by wagons and soldiers. The same wide sky stretched above, unchanged, watching as the land slowly healed. Children who had known the war only through fragments of memory began to grow into a world that was quieter. For them, the conflict became something spoken of in stories, something that belonged to the past rather than the present. But even in those stories, the details remained. The long journeys, the waiting, the endurance, the moments of fear and resilience. For the soldiers who returned home, whether British or Boer, the war did not simply end when they left the battlefield. It remained with them in memory and in silence. The vast distances they had crossed, the long days of waiting, the sudden moments of action, all of it became part of their understanding of the world. Some returned to farms, others to cities, carrying with them experiences that could not easily be put into words. The land itself held these memories in a different way. There were places where the ground still bore the marks of conflict, faint depressions where trenches had once been, scattered remnants of camps, fragments of metal and stone left behind. Over time, these traces faded, softened by wind and rain, but they never disappeared completely. They became part of the landscape, quiet reminders of what had taken place. As the years passed, the region moved gradually toward a new political future. The idea of unity began to take shape, leading toward the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910. This was not a simple or immediate transformation, but a process shaped by negotiation, compromise, and the shared understanding that the past could not be undone, only built upon. And through all of this, the same quiet rhythm returned, the rhythm that had existed long before the war began. The rising and setting of the sun, the movement of wind across the grass, the distant call of animals in the night. These were constants, steady and unchanged, grounding the land in something deeper than conflict. The Boer War, though finished, did not vanish. It became part of the story of the land, woven into its history, carried in its silence. It was remembered not only for its battles, but for its endurance, its distance, and the quiet way it reshaped everything it touched. And in the end, what remained was not only the memory of war, but the slow return of stillness, a stillness that settled gently over the veldt, where time moved forward once again, unhurried, patient, and endless.